Today we're going to be chatting about this book, which I just finished, The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. My friend recommended this book to me and I really enjoyed it. Before I get into the details though, I want to mention that there are spoilers in this review. So if this book is on your TBR, do not watch this video because it'll spoil a lot of things. With that warning out of the way, let's dive right into this book. This is a mystery. I guess you could also call it a thriller or historical fiction because it's set in the 60s and 70s. There are two central mysteries to this book, and it revolves around a couple of children going missing from the same family. They're actually siblings. This book takes around 500 pages to solve those two mysteries, but it didn't feel like 500 pages to me because I found the book really well written. Let's talk about a few things that I loved about this book. The author uses 500 pages very well in terms of the number of themes that she explores in this book. Of course, there are the themes of grief and loss that come from children going missing. As well, there are themes of classism with very rich families in this book alongside working class families, the legacies and reputation that these rich families are trying to protect, but also the reputation and integrity of working class families. Those themes are very beautifully interwoven in this book. The portrayal of a dysfunctional family is done very well. Also, the author is very good at describing how alcoholism can creep up on someone. I'm sure there are more, but the last themes that I'll mention are very near and dear to me, and these are themes of independence, of being yourself, of finding yourself. There's also a through line of feminism in this book that really resonated with me. Overall, I think the author is very, very skilled at describing the very human nature of making difficult decisions. And while I wouldn't necessarily agree with some of the decisions or actions that are taken in this book, I understand why these choices are made. And I think that's a result of both the author understanding human nature very well and also being able to write very well to convey these messages. The second thing that I really loved about this book is that the story held my interest. There were enough twists and turns to keep me very, very interested in the plot. I couldn't really put my finger on the ending. I couldn't predict it outright, but there were enough clues sprinkled in throughout the book that when the reveals happened, they weren't that shocking or surprising. I could go back and reread certain passages and be like, oh yes, this is what I was curious about here, or this alluded to this, or this person did this, which resulted in this. So mysteries that do that, that leave enough breadcrumbs that don't tell you too much about where the story is going, those to me are very well written and well thought out mysteries. I like that I can't exactly guess, but it was something that may have crossed my mind before. In other words, the aha moments were surprising, but they didn't come out of left field. I wasn't left scratching my head. The third thing I loved about this book was that I found the ending very satisfying. The author had alluded to Alice causing Bear's death earlier on in the book, so that part wasn't an out of left field surprise to me, but I still felt this sinking sensation when it was confirmed that this was the case. It was just so tragic and so sad. That part was probably the most emotional part of the book for me, just thinking about Bear's love for his mother, this smart, intuitive, lively child wanting to simultaneously please and protect his mother, and just the tragic accident that happened was very overwhelming for me in terms of my emotions. I also loved the reveal that Barbara had survived. So this I didn't realize until very close to the reveal, but that made me feel so good. I was very, very happy that she had taken her life into her own hands and decided that she was going to step away from this controlling family, even though the family provides her with a lot of comfort. It's a rich family, so she'd be taken care of for the rest of her life, but she didn't want to live that way. She wanted to be her own person, forge her own path, and that's a message that really resonates with me for many different reasons. I really loved the compassion, the empathy, and the nuance in Judy's decision not to solve the case in a public way, story in terms of revealing that she had found Barbara alive. I thought that was a very interesting decision that, again, personally really resonated with me as the type of person that I am. I could see myself making that same decision if I were in Judy's situation. One small thing is I really loved the name of the last section of the book. It's called Self-Reliance, both named after the main house that the rich family owns, but with the added layer that Barbara is becoming self-reliant, and as well TJ would be self-reliant because the decision that her father had made, which affected the course of her entire life thus far, she was now essentially undoing, and she was also following her path. So overall, I thought this book was fantastic in its messaging, the way it was written, in the plot. I loved all of the different themes. There were a couple of things though that I didn't like about this book. The first is that it was very, very choppy. There are a lot of characters and we follow a lot of different perspectives, and it also jumps around quite a bit in terms of what point in time we're in the story. So a lot of present day, but a lot of going back in time as well. I do generally like multiple POV books and I do like time jumps and such, but I felt that many of the chapters in this book were too short and it didn't allow for the character development that could come from longer chapters. So as a result, I felt very detached from the characters. I was interested in the story, I was interested in the plot, but a lot of the characters fell kind of flat for me in terms of their personalities. I couldn't really distinguish one from the other. And even in the middle of the book, I was like, who's Louise again? Because it had been so long since we had followed her story. And she's like one of the main characters. The book starts off with Louise's story. So for me to forget who she was in the middle of the book, and I didn't read this book over a long period of time. I think I finished it in 4 to 5 days. That meant to me that I wasn't really connecting with that character. I was confusing her story with a lot of the other stories in the book. For 92% of this book, I didn't really feel any sort of emotional connection with the story, with the characters, etc. Again, I was interested, so I kept reading, but there was no emotional connection. It was only in the last 8% of the book where the story became very emotionally resonant for me, and that was when the reveal about Bear happened through the perspective of Vic Hewitt. That brings me to the second thing I didn't like about this book. I thought the pacing was a little bit slow, even though I read it very quickly, and I did find it to be somewhat of a page turner, mainly because almost every chapter ended in a cliffhanger. Usually I don't like that at all, and I did find it a little bit frustrating at times that this was happening. So I found myself often stopping reading in the middle of a chapter when I felt like it was a good time to pause, because I didn't want to get to the end of the chapter and be left on a cliffhanger, because then I would feel compelled to read on. The other thing about these end of chapter cliffhangers is that the story will jump to a different perspective, sometimes for quite a while before circling back to that original cliffhanger. And then when the story picked back up again, I couldn't really remember what the cliffhanger was, so I found I was flipping back a lot in the book. And with a physical book, especially such a long book, it's quite hard to do that. So I didn't love that about the book. I was also getting a little bit worried towards the end due to the pacing, because the last 8% of the book, when I started to get really emotionally invested in the story and in the characters, there were only 38 pages left out of a 476 page book. So I thought the ending might be rushed. I didn't think it would wrap up that nicely. Fortunately, I was very happy with the ending and it didn't feel that rushed to me. Overall, I will say that I did love this book. So I would give this book a 4.5 out of 5. For Goodreads, I would round it down to a 4 simply because it wasn't quite a 5-star book for me, but I thought it was really well written and I highly enjoyed reading it. Now let's jump into Goodreads and react to some of those reviews. Here's the listing for The God of the Woods in Goodreads. The average rating was quite high at 4.13. It's a mystery, thriller, historical fiction, literary fiction, suspense. Now let's filter the reviews once again for newest reviews in English, and we'll start with the 5-star. I'll read 2 or 3 of each depending on how long they are. The first review we're going to read together is by Hannah. Perfect murdery mystery summer read. Page turner AF and never saw a single plot twist coming. I thought this was a great read. I did find it to be a page turner for the reasons that I mentioned before. It is quite cliffhangery. There were quite a few plot twists and reveals and red herrings and the like. There were clues about these, but as I mentioned before, I found these very hard to predict with any sort of precision. Let's take a look at the next review by Ava. Such a great summer read. So we have 2 reviews in a row that talked about this being a great summer read. These reviews are all very short, but here is another 5-star review by Melissa. The best book I've read in years. Can't wait to read more books by this author. I did take a look at 1 or 2 other books by the same author, by Liz Moore, and I don't think either of them were mysteries. So I don't know if this author has a specific genre that she sticks to. It doesn't seem like it, but I'm curious about what her other books are, and if she did write another mystery, I might be curious to read that down the road. Move on to the 4-star reviews. This one's a little bit longer, by Catherine. Definitely a page turner. Well written, if maybe a little wordy. I think the major resolution at the end was decently satisfying, but the author created so many storylines that didn't get much resolution at all that it feels a little unfinished and unfocused. I simultaneously liked the time/perspective hops, but can also see how they contributed to the feeling of a lack of focus. This is an interesting review, and I, for the most part, would agree with it, except that I didn't really feel like the story was unfinished at the end. Often with these multiple POV books, the stories do seem very scattered and then they come together at the end. So I didn't really feel like there was a lack of focus. I thought it was actually pretty focused in terms of giving us the information that we would need later, especially with the Jacob character. The next 4-star review is by Kathleen, and this is again another short one. Slow start and longer than needed, but captured my attention last third of the book. I can see where the reviewer is coming from here. For me, this book had my attention from the beginning, even though the pacing was a bit slow, but it only became emotionally resonant for me in the last 8% of the book. For me, this was a good length, and I was worried about it going into the book because I had read somewhere, I can't remember where, that this was a slow burn, and I don't do that well with slow burn in terms of books or movies. So I was worried that I was going to be really bored. I was worried I would never want to read it. I was worried that it would take me a really long time to read, and none of those things happened. Okay, let's do one more 4-star review from Samantha. Definitely a long, slow burn, but the multiple POVs, historical fiction elements, and dual mystery kept me reading. Very melancholy at times, though, in ways that felt like real gut punches. A nice stick it to the wealthy twist helped in the recovery. I agree with this review overall, even though I didn't really find this to be a slow burn, at least not in the way that I was expecting. So maybe my expectations played into what I thought about the book. The dual mystery definitely kept me reading. I wanted to know what would happen. I cared enough about the story to want to know the ending. This book definitely has a major theme of classism running through it, and particularly it has a lot to say about the ultra wealthy, the way they treat people, how they're very exclusive or exclusionary. And I also found the stick it to the wealthy ending very satisfying. It felt like the right thing was finally happening because this family got away with so much for so many years. And I definitely agree that it is very melancholy at times, and there were some real gut punches in there. There were a lot of themes of dysfunctional families, dysfunctional relationships, abusive relationships, a lot of control within relationships, alcoholism, and of course the grief of having lost not one but two children. That's one of the reasons I don't really view this as a summer read. It's a little bit too dark for me for a summer read, but I still read it in the summer and I still enjoyed it. Let's move on to the 3-star reviews. The first one is by Lisa. This book had potential of being far better with less characters and fewer timeline jumps. Too many pages, too many abusive, inattentive parents. The conclusion was abrupt and unsatisfying. Strong positives are Yudita and TJ. I agree that the characters named in this review, Yudita or Judy and TJ, I felt were the most likable characters, but I personally thought that the strongest written character in terms of how much we got to know about her was Alice. She is the mother of Bear and Barbara, who are the two children that go missing. And when the reveal happened about Bear and the part that she played in his death, it was very devastating. And I think I felt that because her character was so well developed. If more of the characters could be as well developed as she was, then I think this book would have been a 5-star book for me. The rest of this review, although I can see why the reviewer felt this way, I didn't personally have the same experience. Let's move on to the next review, and that is from Jenna. 3.75. Started strong, then dragged on a little. Once again, I can see why the reviewer felt this way, but I had a different experience with the book. For me, the book did start off strong, and then it lagged a little bit, but then it picked up again. I think I read the last half of this book in a day, whereas the first half of the book took me maybe 3 or 4 days. All right, last review in the 3-star category. Oh, this is a longer review. Oh, perfect. Okay. Long mystery. I think about this book when I think about Chinese torture. There is a mystery, actually, too. Bear Van Leer's age 19. I'm just jumping in here to say I think this is a typo. Bear is actually 8 years old in this book when he disappears. So I'll just make that correction. Bear Van Leer's age 8 disappears, and years later, his older sister Barbara disappeared too. Every chapter is titled in the name of one of the important characters. The time shifts back and forth, the chapters switch perspectives. Drip by drip, the reader learns a little more about the families involved, the campers, the townsfolk, the rich, the poor, the husbands and wives, the betrayals, the bonds. And I asked myself, if it wasn't my book club's choice, would I have bothered to finish nearly 500 pages of superfluous backstory? Not sure. I did have a guess or two as to what happened, but I was wrong. It was that, in the end, that kept me going back, but honestly, it could have been 100 pages shorter and a much better novel. In the end, I felt there was one very big part of the resolution that was overlooked. I finished. I'm excited to talk about this review because there is a lot that I agree with, especially the part where the reviewer describes us as being fed the story drip by drip. That's definitely what it felt like, because some of the chapters were so short. They were literally a page and a half or 2 pages long, which I felt was too short. So that did feel like drip by drip. And the story comes together in these slices. So it did jump around a lot more than I had wanted it to. And the other part that I really agree with is the part where the reviewer says, I had a guess or two as to what happened. And that was what kept me going back to the book. I felt that way as well. I'm curious what this reviewer thinks was overlooked in terms of the resolution. Reading this review, nothing really jumps out at me as something that was overlooked. Maybe if it were in the review, I would be like, oh yeah, that was unresolved, but off the top of my head, I can't think of what that could be. It is now time for the 2-star reviews. Here's one by Sam. I liked the writing, but so many characters and so long, and I just didn't care about a single person. I kind of feel this way even though I enjoyed the book. At the top of this video, I mentioned that I didn't connect with any of the characters, and I felt quite detached reading this book for the most part because I was like, I don't really care what happens, but I'm just really curious to keep reading. So I can see where this reviewer is coming from. There were a lot of characters and this book was very long. Next is a review by Peggy. A rather complex plot and 92 characters made this book kind of a chore to finish. Both the solution to the mystery and the ending of the book left me flat. There were a lot of what I would call red herrings, but really it's just human behavior, I think, because you're never certain what someone else is thinking. You don't know what their motives are. You don't know what their actual intentions are. I think there was a lot of that in this book because it was written in third person from a lot of different perspectives. You're left guessing about a lot of different dynamics and such. So I think that made the plot feel more complicated than it actually was. but in the end, when the resolution unfolded in the book, I thought it was pretty straightforward. There were just a lot of things to throw the reader off because this is a mystery. Let's read one more 2-star review. This one is by Megan. Another book I was excited to read but did not finish. The first few chapters were great, and then it got bland and boring, repetitive somehow. I flipped ahead many chapters and tried to start again, but meh. I received this book via a neighborhood library, so we'll take it back for someone else to enjoy. I never considered DNFing this book, which is not something I can say about every book because there are so many perspectives and many of the chapters are so short. It can feel a bit repetitive. In fact, a couple of the storylines that I kept confusing for whatever reason were Louise and Alice. I don't know why, but their storylines kind of blended together for me. In the end, I was able to separate them because Alice became a more well-developed character for me, but I kept forgetting who Louise was, which was just such a strange thing. I don't know why that kept happening. It is now time for the last set of reviews that we're going to read together, and those are 1-star reviews. The first one is from Heather. I wanted to like it with the hype it gets, but I just couldn't after the first chapter. I didn't realize this book had a lot of hype. My friend had highly recommended it, but I hadn't really heard anything about it. I don't really follow books on social media though. I enjoy doing these reviews, but mainly they're just a chance for me to reflect. There's like a book club feel that I really like. I just like chatting about books, but it's so hard to find someone who's read the same book, so I find this is a very enjoyable practice for me. The next 1-star review is another DNF from Kaylee. I wanted to finish this one. I was really looking forward to reading it, but man, about 60% of the way through, I was so bored. I kept reading, trying to make myself finish it, but I realized I didn't actually care what happened or how it ended. That's definitely a sign to DNF, and I do this myself quite a bit with fiction. I will force myself to keep reading it, thinking that it's gonna get better, or I have FOMO that I'm gonna miss out on like a great ending or like a huge twist. There's always something like that comes up in my mind that convinces me to keep going. I recently DNF'd my first book in I can't even remember how long, many years, and I felt so good about DNFing that book, and it was for exactly the same reasons that Kaylee mentioned. I didn't care what would happen next or how it would end, and I never actually even looked up the ending for that book because I really didn't care about it. All right, last review is from Zer. This is Goodreads Choice Award for 2024. Really? I didn't know this had won an award on Goodreads, so that is really interesting to me. I did look up when this book was published, and it was in July of 2024, so it's been out for pretty much exactly a year. That is going to be it for my review of The God in the Woods by Liz Moore. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. I'll be back very soon with another video. Until then, please take care and bye for now.